Welcome to Forensic Myth Monday, where popular crime myths meet forensic science. Every Monday, we take a forensic claim you have probably heard in movies, true crime stories, or even in social media and put it under the microscope. Because in forensic science, what sounds convincing is not always what the evidence actually tells us. So, are you ready to separate forensic fact from forensic fiction? Let's bust today's myth. Today we are entering the fascinating and often misunderstood world of serial killers. You have probably heard that every serial killer has a unique signature and that anyone who repeatedly kills must be a psychopath. But are these really forensic facts, or are they myths created by true crime and movies? Let's find out. Let's start with the word signature. When people hear serial killer signature, they often imagine something dramatic, a killer leaving the same object at every crime scene, arranging victims in exactly the same way, or repeating the same bizarre ritual. But forensic reality is much more complicated. A behavioral signature generally refers to aspects of an offender's behavior that go beyond what is necessary to successfully commit the crime and may reflect particular psychological or emotional needs. And this is where we need to introduce another important forensic term, modus operandi or MO. Your MO is essentially your method of operating. It includes the practical behaviors an offender uses to commit a crime. For example, how they approach or control a victim, how they carry out the offense, and how they attempt to avoid detection. And here's the important difference. Modus operandi can change. An offender can learn from previous crimes. They can become more experienced. They can change their methods because something went wrong previously. They can adapt because they are trying to avoid detection. So the way an offender commits their first crime may not be exactly the same way they commit a later one. Now consider something different. Imagine an offender repeatedly performs a behavior that is not actually necessary to commit the crime. Perhaps the offender repeatedly poses a victim, takes a particular type of personal item, or engages in some other recurring behavior. If investigators identify a consistent pattern and have reason to believe that behavior serves a psychological or emotional purpose, they may consider it signature-like behavior. But here comes our first myth: every serial killer has a signature. Not every serial offender will have a dramatic, recognizable signature. Real crime scenes are rarely as neat and predictable as television makes them appear. Investigators cannot simply walk into a crime scene, notice one strange object, and say, "That's the killer's signature." Instead, investigators look for patterns across multiple cases. They may compare victim characteristics, locations, methods, behaviors, objects taken or left behind, and other details. The FBI's behavioral analysis resources describe how investigators can compare violent crimes and examine behavioral patterns to identify potentially related offenses. So, a recurring behavior can be important, but it is not a magical forensic fingerprint. And this distinction matters because investigators also have to consider something called behavioral consistency. If a behavior appears in several crimes, investigators need to determine whether the similarity is actually meaningful or whether it simply happened because of similar circumstances. In other words, not every repeated behavior is a signature, and not every difference between crimes means the crimes were committed by different people. That's why forensic investigation looks at the overall pattern rather than one sensational clue. Now let's move to the second and perhaps even more popular myth: all serial killers are psychopaths. This idea appears everywhere: movies, television, true crime documentaries, social media. But scientifically, it's not that simple. Serial killers are not one psychologically identical group. Some serial murderers may display traits associated with psychopathy, but that does not mean that every serial murderer is a psychopath. And here's an important point that is often forgotten. Not all psychopaths are serial killers. Psychopathy is a personality construct involving a combination of characteristics that can include traits such as lack of empathy or remorse, interpersonal dominance, and certain patterns of antisocial behavior. But you cannot diagnose psychopathy simply because someone committed a terrible crime, and you certainly cannot identify a psychopath just by looking at someone's face. There is no psychopath face. There is no special look in someone's eyes, and there is no single personality trait that automatically proves psychopathy. In forensic settings, psychological characteristics must be evaluated systematically rather than assumed from appearance or from one behavior. The FBI has also emphasized that psychopathy should not simply be treated as synonymous with criminality or violence. So why are serial killers and psychopaths so often connected? Because there can be overlap. Some serial murderers have demonstrated characteristics associated with psychopathy, such as manipulation, lack of remorse, sensation seeking, or a desire for control, but that does not mean psychopathy explains every case of serial murder. Human behavior is much more complicated than that. Different offenders can have different motivations, backgrounds, personalities, and behavioral patterns. So when someone says serial killer equals psychopath, that's not forensic science, that's a stereotype. Let's make this really simple. Imagine three different situations. Person A repeatedly uses the same practical method because it works. That's primarily related to their modus operandi. Person B repeatedly performs an unnecessary behavior during their crimes, and investigators believe it may satisfy a particular psychological need that may be considered a signature-like behavior. Person C demonstrates characteristics associated with psychopathy that tells us something about personality traits, but it does not automatically mean this person is a serial killer. Three different concepts: modus operandi, signature, psychopathy. They can overlap, but they are not interchangeable. And this is one of the biggest lessons for forensic science students. A behavior is not automatically a diagnosis. A repeated behavior is not automatically a signature, and a violent offender is not automatically a psychopath. Now let's talk about why these myths are so convincing. Crime dramas often give us the image of the perfect serial killer, extremely intelligent, emotionless, manipulative, always several steps ahead of investigators and leaving behind a perfectly recognizable signature. It makes for great television. But real forensic investigation is not a television episode. There is no universal serial killer personality, there is no guaranteed signature, and there is no magical behavioral clue that instantly reveals the identity of an offender. Investigators have to work with evidence. They document crime scenes, they examine physical and biological evidence, they compare cases, they study victimology, they evaluate behavioral patterns, and they develop hypotheses that must be tested against evidence. Behavioral analysis can assist an investigation, but it doesn't replace forensic evidence, and it certainly doesn't allow investigators to simply look at a crime scene and know exactly what kind of person committed the crime. So let's return to our two myths. Myth number one: every serial killer has a signature. False. Some offenders may demonstrate recurring behaviors that investigators interpret as signature-like, but there is no rule that every serial killer must have a recognizable signature. Myth number 2, every serial killer is a psychopath. Again, false. Psychopathic traits may occur in some serial murderers, but serial murder and psychopathy are not synonymous. And perhaps the most important forensic lesson is this: never confuse a behavioral pattern with a psychological diagnosis. A strange behavior at a crime scene doesn't automatically reveal an offender's personality. A repeated behavior does not automatically prove a signature, and a violent offender cannot automatically be labeled a psychopath. Forensic science requires us to look beyond the stereotype. We need evidence, patterns, scientific assessment, and careful reasoning. Because real forensic investigation is rarely as simple as we found the signature so we know the killer, or they killed repeatedly so they must be a psychopath. The reality is much more complicated, and that's exactly what makes forensic science so fascinating. So the next time you hear that every serial killer has a signature or that every serial killer is a psychopath, remember, real forensic science is far more complicated than what we see on screen. If you enjoyed busting this forensic myth with me, don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow forensic science enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating forensic facts and myths. And remember, don't believe everything you see in the crime shows. Question the myth, follow the evidence. I'll see you next Monday for another Forensic Myth Monday.